Love podcasts, hate teaching religion in schools. It's the PoliticsJOE podcast. Would you like to explain that take?
Nope. I'll keep that in the secrecy of the unrecorded world.
All right. Well, Laura and I were pro it, weren't we?
Yeah.
But there we go. Okay.
That's it.
So it's a really big day, isn't it, in terms of defense and geopolitics?
It is.
It's really exciting. So Ukraine's going to become American.
Yeah, and
Some of it.
colonized.
Some of it. The rest of it's going to become Russian.
What's going to happen? What's a brief overview? So there was a piece in the Telegraph overnight, and it was a leaked document that had been submitted by the American administration over to Zelensky. What does Trump want?
Essentially, Trump is looking for 50% of the Ukrainian oil reserves, current oil reserves. 50% of the revenue will go to America. Future oil reserves, also 50% of those will go to America. America is also looking for precious metal reserves in Ukraine, and all of this is to do with the amount of aid that America has given Ukraine in the last 2.5 years. They reckon that it amounts to about $500 billion, which Trump says is roughly what the Americans have given Ukraine so far. According to the Telegraph, it's closer to about $170 billion. So seems like a good deal for America.
That exchange rate, or what is it, like deflation? He's just or inflation.
Yeah.
He's like, well, 170 billion a couple of years ago is now 500 billion.
An extra 330 bill for the
I
big
think that
boy.
makes sense.
I think it's like testament to Donald Trump, how Donald Trump views diplomacy, which is just purely transactional and like a businessman. But I wonder if behind the scenes, Putin is just rubbing his hands in glee at this proposed deal and what the negotiations will look like, because Putin is sending the officials that have kept him in power for the past decades, and Trump is sending the former city commissioner for Miami and a real estate dealer to negotiate with these guys. Meanwhile, Putin is getting everything he wants, which is the maintenance of the territory that they've invaded, no NATO membership for Ukraine or security assurances, and Ukraine not at the table, and the possibility of Russia having the sanctions relaxed on it. So I think he might be quite optimistic about this.
What would be wrong with sending a couple of seasoned businessmen over to Russia to strike a deal? Is that not the art of it?
I mean, famously never bankrupt Donald Trump is striking that deal. So I don't know what his track record says about that.
I suppose this could mean that we're looking at, so he's going to make Gaza the Riviera of the Middle East. And then we'll have we'll have
Another Texas in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. Pro, con?
I've never been to Texas, so I'm not sure. I mean, I've never been to Ukraine either, so I'm not sure whether I'd like Ukraine being Texas.
What else could they import from Texas into Ukraine? Their pursuit of free speech, perhaps.
American football.
Hot
dogs.
That would be good. So you know how like the NFL plays a couple of games in London as part of the season. They do a couple of games per season in the Donbass.
Would that? Well, no, because Donbass would be Russia.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, but doesn't he want quite a bit of that? Isn't there bits in the Donbass that he wants?
Trump.
I
think that was one of the things that I read in the article was that it also gave me an image of The Simpsons of to do with some of the current oil reserves. A major site is in the Donbass. And so the confusion is, well, what oil reserves is he looking at, given that most of them are already in the control of Russia? And I just had this image, do you know in The Simpsons when the school has an oil reserve underneath it and then Mr. Burns does like the vertical oil pump?
Yes.
Or the whatever, and just pumps it this way. That's Trump's plan for the Donbass, is to just have right on the border this oil rig that's going slanted into the ground to pull it all out. I can't remember what your initial question was. I was just completely invested in that Simpsons image.
I think that was an important image to bring to us. But Laura, I mean, so This is sort of out of kilter with what the EU leaders would like to see happen in that region. And they all met yesterday in Paris. Was there a successful conversation that left that room?
I think it's kind of shown how impotent the EU are in this whole conversation, or not just the EU, but the EU and UK, because they came out of that meeting with no clear agreement on whether EU and UK troops should be positioned in Ukraine. You had Starmer being quite enthusiastically for it, but then people like Giorgia Meloni and Donald Tusk not being as confident with that. So you have a split in Europe that are already not that influential. What do you think that will mean for Starmer going over to see Trump next week?
Well, he's confirmed it now, hasn't he? He's confirmed that he's going next week. Next Wednesday, he'll be there in the Oval Office and he'll be expected to relay that message. For me, the timing just seems all a little bit off. I mean, to an entire week, especially with someone like Donald Trump at the helm of negotiations, all of this could either be signed, sealed, delivered, or completely forgotten about by then.
Yeah, but also, like, if it isn't signed off, Trump, you could just imagine him just saying, fuck off. Like, this is what I want to do. You know, like, I feel like I'm being the prime diplomat by bringing Putin back into the international frame. I've capitulated to some of his demands, or basically all of his demands, really. And so what do you guys want? Like, there's not really the thing, I guess, if you're looking at it from the right-wing angle, is this thing of, if it doesn't end now, does it mean that we just continue to give money to Ukraine forever? And they continue to fight on the borders of the already held territories, the already Russian-held territories? Or do you just say, right, you've gotten this, you keep that? And I think the only thing you could feasibly object to now, I wouldn't commit to say that much, but the only thing that you could see the Europeans objecting to is how much sovereignty is being given up by Ukraine to America in this deal without the NATO membership. So it seems quite a strange, like, third country relationship with the West to have if you effectively, all of your land and resources are owned by the American empire, but you have no protection from any breaches of your sovereignty by a third country like Russia.
Surely that puts them in a more powerful position, though.
Ukraine.
If Ukraine is American, all right, okay, so.
Well, yeah.
Let's just go, like, really
if it's like the Iraq of Eastern Europe or something.
No, worse than that. If it's like, if America is like, hey, that's a big cash cow for us.
Yeah.
If you touch that, you sniff anywhere near it, you're gone, fella.
Yeah.
Like, that's the.
But that's the question as well, I suppose, isn't it? Is that, like, are there going to be American troops on the ground and just American troops? Like, so far, there's nothing in what was leaked that indicates that. But going off of previous American interests in the last 20 years, you would assume that they'd at least have a handful of squaddies stood around oil rigs for the foreseeable future, you know, which probably would protect Ukraine to some extent, but not. I wouldn't be reassured if I was living in Ukraine at that prospect.
It's Cold War territory, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's because some of these what he's after, some of these oil reserves are literally on the border, right? So you are going to have a pretty clear line of where America begins and Russia ends. It's laughable because it will be American by proxy.
I mean, it's just, Ukraine is just being caught in between two imperial powers and their politics. And I think it actually shows how similar just Trump and Putin are operating. Like, at home, they have no regard for a free press. They have no regard for domestic law. And then abroad, they're both acting the same way with no regard for international law, which I think is a very scary prospect for Europe. And I think Starmer was right when he said that Ukraine is the front line of British security, because we're much more, without the armies and the economies of Russia and the US behind us, we're completely vulnerable to any breach of international law. So it's in our self-interest, I think, to be, swinging the bat for protecting and upholding international law.
And the US is still the backstop in his mind. I hated that term came back out.
What does it mean? What does it mean? The US backstop. The US is dictating the terms of everything. How are they And
I mean, ultimately, it would be a real US backstop if Ukraine was American. I think that would probably...
It would be.
But the ultimate backstop would be for Ukraine to be a NATO member, because then America would have to defend it, which is what they don't want to do just now.
But he's not that keen on NATO, is he? He's not that bothered by it.
No, because I guess it would mean that they would have to get involved in a full-blown war, which it just seems there's economic interests and there's no military or any kind of social interest.
Well, I suppose that's how he constructs a deal. It is monetary. It never is. It's, as you said at the beginning, he's not really got any interest in diplomacy for like diplomacy's sake. It's like there's got to be some cash here at some point.
But that's the thing, isn't it? Like if there's American capital interest, like formalized American capital interests in Ukraine with that deal, you cannot conceive of, apart from being a Cold War territory, like an Afghanistan or Vietnam or something, you can't conceive of Russia going further in and seizing American property, because America would retaliate at that point. I struggle with the NATO argument, not as a neutral Irish cook, but just in terms of like the way that, well, like there is some diversity in how the right view Ukraine, right? The American right basically seem to just be, let Putin rip, let him go as far in as he wants and just take it all back over so we don't have to pay for it anymore. Farage previously has been humming and hawing about his position on it, but where he's kind of been consistent is, if you look at it from the angle of Russia, that has had all of the Balkan states, recently Finland and Sweden, all join NATO. You would consider that an act of aggression if your opposing territory or your opposing state superstructure was on your doorstep. And then the only Eastern European countries that you could really say have kind of a sphere of influence after like Maidan Square and everything like that is Ukraine and Belarus. And so Ukraine is kind of this diplomatic battleground in terms of what the future of allies versus Putin looks like, right? If you end up having NATO troops on the ground there, the only country that is bordering Russia at that point that isn't a NATO member is Belarus. That already has all of the kind of like 2014-esque pro-democracy protests when it came to the elections last time out. So it is all changing around Russia. And I'm not sure. I feel like it, and again, I don't want to sound like a cook, but if you start to kind of provoke by putting NATO troops on the ground right next to Russia, whilst Russia is going through this massive transition of influence in that area, you're gonna get bitten. You know, if it's a country with the influence and scale of Putin's Russia, you cannot expect him to not retaliate, you know.
But the argument would be that he possibly shouldn't go into sovereign territory anyway, regardless.
Absolutely.
I think the NATO argument like completely lets Russia off the hook, and like because I think that Ukraine wasn't in NATO and it wasn't going to be in NATO, and he still invaded. He went into Crimea, he went into Chechnya, and now again he's done it in the Donbass. And I think Ukrainians know that without NATO protection, he's going to keep expanding into Ukraine. So I think it doesn't actually have anything to do with NATO provocation. I think that's like a narrative.
But in Georgia, you had the thing of like he took South Ossetia, and there's kind of this like jokey bit now where soldiers from either side, like during the night, will move a post in the ground of just like the border is constantly changing in South Ossetia, but there's no military action there anymore. Again, not a cook, but would we say that he's happy with Donbass and the other regions that they have, and that's the end of it? Do we think he's going to go further in? And if he takes all of Ukraine, barring out this deal, if he takes all of Ukraine, is he going to go into Poland? Is he going to go into the Balkans? Is he going to go into Finland and Sweden? Probably not.
Well, they made a big argument, didn't they, at the beginning of the war because a couple of missiles went into Poland. They were like, he's coming for Poland.
But then it
was like, they're just a bit shit, actually. It was an accident.
Yeah, it was Ukraine. It was also Ukrainian misfires at some points as well.
That's what I mean.
Oh, right. Yeah.
They're all just...
Yeah.
The tech isn't that great.
Yeah.
There was an argument going about, the commentators were arguing last night about how this is like the Czechoslovakia moment, that this is like when the UK and France gave a bit of Czechoslovakia to Hitler and they were like, oh, well, he'll calm down now. And then he didn't. I don't think it's like that at all. Like, I think it's, well, the argument is so far progressed beyond that now. We're talking about having a de facto American state bang next to Russia. This is like far more aggressive than even like the sort of the height of the Cold War when we're talking about like, missiles on Cuba or like, the edge of Russia, like eyeballing Alaska. Like it's so much further than that now to have like American oil on the border with Russia. It's just surely that is the precursor to, God, I'm going to sound really overdramatic. I'm going to sound so FPPE. But surely that is the precursor to a third world war. He goes and sniffs around that oil. Right, okay, so say we have peace. This deal goes through. We have peace for a hot minute. Putin goes sniffing around those oil reserves.
Yeah.
What does America do? How do they retaliate?
Yeah. I mean, you would hope that given that the deal was done with Putin in the first place, and it seems like his fingerprints are all over what was leaked, that it would be enough. But also like this kind of, you would like to think that on the American side, two things. They want to come off as the peace brokers in this situation, but they also don't want to come off like fucking Egypt. They don't want to do a deal and then a year down the line the deal be crumbling because whatever they had proposed and whatever they agreed with Putin isn't feasible anymore.
The thing is, I don't really understand how there could be any like sustained peace in Ukraine if Ukraine haven't had a seat at the table while carving out this deal. Because how well has it worked in the past when two imperial powers have carved up a country?
It's giving Berlin Conference.
Yeah.
It's giving.
My favorite bit of the Berlin Conference is Portugal came to the table saying that actually they had a right over all of Africa. And so their proposal was, we just take control of everything. Their reason for that was the Treaty of Tordesillas during the Age of Exploration, where the Pope divided South America between Portugal and Spain. And so everything everything east of the very tip of South America belonged to Portugal. So they were just like, yeah, so the Pope said it, it's ours.
What does all of this mean and the US's approach mean for UK defence spending domestically?
I don't know, you tell me. Do you know?
It puts pressure on Keir Starmer to increase domestic defence spending. And I think he's going from 2.3%, which it is currently, to 2.5%. But the US would like it to be at 5% of British GDP, which I think is 80 billion pounds, which is crazy. And it would mean severe cuts to everything bar education and health.
11% departmental cuts, which, by the way, like the thing I'd love to see in these headlines, and actually maybe we should get the Resolution Foundation in to actually talk about this, is the sort of compound cuts that have taken place on these departments since 2010. They're on their knees. Yeah. I mean, I had like a couple of people from, how specific can I be? A couple of civil servants messaged me last night. And it was just like, they basically said like, there is nothing to cut. There is nothing. And so they said it's probably going to be staff that they end up cutting.
Whilst they're also working on a backlog, right? Because like, that's the common thing that gets missed out, I suppose, when it comes to domestic politics, is that they're not, whenever the government makes an announcement, that announcement doesn't get underway immediately. Like there's work that even the Conservatives put into force, that is still being done by civil servants. So they're still doing things from 2 years ago or 1 year ago that were on a budget of X amount of staff, X amount of resources, and you're in the immediate term cutting the members of staff that are working on these projects. So ultimately, nothing ever gets done.
Absolutely. And they've just hired, Labour have just brought in, actually the Tories did too, a load of DWP staff to crack down on these quote unquote benefit scroungers. So people who've accidentally claimed an extra £2 here and an extra £4 here, they've hired in people on, big contracts to crack down on them.
Rightly so.
Seems like a really good use of money.
Well, benefit cheats cheat us all,
Yes, so. Sure. It's the case for a wealth tax.
It's always been there, just floating it out again.
Yep. We're just saying that maybe you could ask them for a bit of cash.
I was saying it on the desk yesterday that this idea that we can't tax wealthy people because they'll leave. And so that's why we tax ordinary people and we cut from people on the verge of poverty. Mm-hmm. They leave as well. If you look at stories that over the last 5 or 6 years in this country of newly qualified nurses immediately moving to Australia and immediately moving to the Middle East, like Dubai or wherever, that for me, the idea that, we can't tax wealthy people because they'll get up and fuck off, it just doesn't wash, because you've got a handful of those guys. You've got thousands of people that are just being pushed further and further and further into the ground. Eventually, they're just going to say, well, what's the use of me living here anymore?
So Christopher Chope said something quite fun over Christmas. I think we were on Times Radio together, and I said something, just part of something I was saying. I said, public sector workers who are the backbone of our society. Mm-hmm. He just interrupted me to go, excuse me. Excuse me. They're not actually. The wealth creators are.
Someone think of the bankers.
Yes. Thank you, Sir Chris.
And it's also even if they do move or they do leave, they can leave, but they can't take, if you own housing in the UK, you can't up and move your housing either.
Watch me. This mass exodus of millionaires just taking the foundations of their home out of the ground, putting it on a ferry.
I think we're going to have to wrap up because we've got our man coming in to talk about the AFD shortly, haven't we?
We do, yeah. In 30 seconds.
From one crisis in Europe to another.
The crisis on Sunday evening, isn't it? The German election.
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Do you have anything else you'd like to add, Laura?
No.
Okay. Well, we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Oh, wait, actually, before you go, please do let us know that you find us insufferable. Comments are below. Bye.